Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. Alright, hello everyone who is tuning in to our episode, and something that we kind of would like to touch on that is a lot really similar to kind of the reason for this podcast and the worldview and the themes that we've been talking about a lot is how there are a lot of Christian themes, not just Christian themes. I mean, there are also other things that influence Tolkien's writings, but I think for Christians, it's there are a lot of things that they can easily pull out and say, "Oh, like, look at these things that Tolkien's trying to emphasize or trying to show people throughout the works." And I guess would people who aren't Christians be so inclined to say "Oh yeah, that's important. That's what he's trying to get across to us," or would they say, "No, this is just based off of mythology, so there's really no reason to be taking that direction to things." And I guess, for instance, we can talk about how they're like Christ figures, such as Gandalf, for instance. Not that we're actually trying to draw an allegory here between Gandalf and Christ, but the kind of idea that he kind of is this, lays down his life for his friends, and then actually returns and then kind of redeems them in a real sense. But Mark, you have any other things that stick out about that that you think maybe people who aren't Christians wouldn't necessarily look at it the same way in the books or whatever?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Whenever we talk about the way Christian themes work in Tolkien's world, I always think of the Inter-Arts Festival for Christians in the arts that was led by Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, and that's Pastor Timothy Keller's church, the late Pastor Timothy Keller. He was a big fan of Tolkien. If you guys ever listen to any of his sermons or read any of his books, he'll always include one Tolkien reference or two. But he talked about how as a Christian artist, you can do two things. You can either point people to Jesus, or you can put on a Christian worldview, like glasses, and look at the world around you, and then show them that worldview. And Tolkien usually does the second thing, where he sort of shows you the world as he sees it. And that's the thing. What's really interesting if you approach this Middle Earth this way, Tolkien isn't really trying to tell an allegory. He's not trying to tell C.S. Lewis's Aslan story. He's trying to he's just saying hey, this is the way the world works. And I think what's really interesting in that is Tolkien doesn't see. He's not trying to make Gandalf necessarily a Christ figure. He just sees this is the way the world works. This is the way good works. Good sacrifices itself for its friends. And he doesn't see death as the end, right? And so that's sort of the way he sees the world. So I don't think it is a Christ analogy, but he's not actually trying to it's not almost an intentional one. I think that's the case with a lot of Christian themes, is that they're actually unintentional or not even. He's just not trying to indoctrinate people. He's just this is the way the world works, and if good triumphs over evil, that's because it really does triumph over evil. So I think it's really interesting that a non-Christian might see that as this isn't a Christ analogy. There's lots of differences between Christ and every other figure we might pull out, and it's sort of just a general way. So I don't think any non-Christian has to oh wow, there's a head-on collision necessarily between the worldview, which I think is actually really interesting and really powerful. That maybe it can subtly influence people to see things in a different light. But yeah, I don't think any I think a non-Christian would be correct if they were hey, this is not exactly a Christ figure, and just because I like Lord of the Rings doesn't mean that I have to, somehow sacrifice my Satan worshipping beliefs or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that's one big thing with Tolkien is that like he was adamant that Lord of the Rings was not an allegory. Um, so like uh, the big contrast between Tolkien and Lewis is that you know, I saw something the other day where it's like Tolkien being like, if one more person says that this is an allegory, I'm gonna be really mad. And then Lewis is like, if one more person doesn't get that Aslan is Jesus, I'm gonna be really mad. So like you have that contrast between the two different ways of telling the story, like you were saying about um, whereas Lewis definitely takes the pointing people to Christ with his stories direction. Tolkien was drawing on Christianity and saw the world through a Christian worldview, but at the same time, he was building his own story and building a world that was drawing from, you know, early British and Scandinavian and Germanic um, stories to build his world alongside the uh, Christian and Judeo-Christian stories and tropes and themes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Is I remember, it was like there was a Facebook group that was posting about a lot of different things, um, but one guy, I don't know if the guy's a Christian or not, um, but he read a book on Tolkien, and he said that he realized that there were a lot of themes, Christian themes, um, that were coming out in there, and maybe it's looking a little more closely than you'd think to find that. But I thought that was kind of interesting that and there wasn't anybody saying, "Oh no, there's no way." Um, so, but yeah,
Yeah, I think that's an important way to talk about it is through themes rather than allegory. So like you can even see, themes of self-sacrifice and taking things on yourself for the good of the world in like Frodo carrying the burden of the ring, which kind of can be compared to Christ taking the burden of sin on himself. And then, of course, there's the most obvious one is Gandalf coming back from the dead and, coming to give guidance in the time of need and, like you said, sort of saving and redeeming the people that he's coming back to. But none of them are directly allegorical in the way that in the way that Aslan is directly allegorical. It's all themes. It's all sort of subtle reflections of the worldview that arises from a Christian upbringing and a Christian understanding of the world, rather than a direct picture of the Christian message.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, because I think there's a sense of like where Tolkien doesn't even necessarily probably even see those themes as like Christian. He just sees them as true. Um, in the same way that like if you were to write a story where like murder was like the right thing to do or something, right? Like where everyone thought that the morally right thing to do is murder. That would be like a terrible story because that's like not only it's like obviously whenever you're creating a new world, you want to like write things that are new and different, but like some things are actually just so fundamental to like our world that we can't understand any world without them. I think that's like why like a lot of those themes that come through, like how sacrifice for the greater good is always like a good thing and stuff. But a lot of those themes I think come through as not just like trying to input Christian themes like explicitly, but like these are just like the fundamental truths of our universe that we can't understand any universe without them. Such as like good in the winning in the end. I will also say if you read Tolkien's books, they come across a little bit more with Christian themes than the movies do. I think especially of
Oh yeah.
after Frodo destroys the ring, there's very much this like almost wedding like celebration that like Aragorn has for him as like the returning hero that is like very reminiscent of the end of Revelation, which is like probably one of the ones that like came across most to me as like a direct reference to the Bible, even more so than maybe even like Gandalf resurrecting or the parts on temptation. So yeah, and that's obviously like you get slightly of it with him reuniting with the Fellowship, but it's very like different in the book and much more of this like almost over the top aspect of like how different heralds are coming in, and there's a massive banquet prepared for him. So
what's really cool too is that not with just themes, but well, I guess just with themes here, like one thing I think is that with Tolkien's works, you have to think a little more and dig a little deeper than just reading, I guess. Sometimes you get a lot out of it. I know there are other fantasy books I've read which are actually more kids books. I've never read like newer fantasy books for like adults really, but I know in those books it's always just a general like interesting story that keeps you captivated, and that's always a little more shallow usually than Tolkien's writings. But again, like most of those books were made for kids or at least teenagers.
To be completely fair, I think you can, if you engage with the Lord of the Rings, maybe not the Silmarillion, because the kind of person that would engage this way wouldn't necessarily read the Silmarillion, but the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit especially, if you engage with them on that level, it's still worth reading. Like, it's still, if you just take it as literature, and you're not digging for themes, you're just taking it as something to read, it's still worthwhile because it's such good literature and it has informed so much of fantasy that has come after it, that it's one of those books where it's like you can read it just to read a good story, and you can read it to get an insight on the author's ideas about the world and about reality. And both of those, I think, especially since, we're on a podcast about Tolkien, our whole thing here is to dig deep into it. I think it's important to call out that, like, it's totally legitimate to just read it just to be a good fantasy novel. Hopefully you'll get more out of it, but, like, that was sort of on the base level, especially The Lord of the Rings. It was written as a product in a lot of ways. Like, Tolkien didn't want to write it at first because his publishers were like, write a sequel to The Hobbit. And it took him, I can't remember how many years, but it took him years and years to actually get to the writing of The Lord of the Rings. And of course, when he did it, he wrote an adult fantasy novel rather than a children's book, which is fairly unorthodox and something that I can only really see Tolkien doing. But it is worthwhile to remember that, like, it is, on some levels, it is also just a really good book to read. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I was gonna add a couple things. Like, I don't like. It's actually really easy to write a story that's like has a lot of deeper themes. That's not good, right? Like, so the best thing you can say about anything is that it's a good story. I think good stories will naturally include some themes, right? Like, if you think of any even very simple stories, will usually have some moral to them. But that's actually, like, I don't know. It's very interesting, but, like, right, if there was just an amoral story, it wouldn't be very good. And a lot of the stories that claim to be like amoral or tell you that like nothing really matters or whatever actually do have a point to them very much. But yeah, like I think it's like not like the base level, or there's like the highest level is like, wow, this is an amazing story, right? Like, you don't have to like break it down bit by bit and like get like mine the deepest parts of it to like just really enjoy it and take away a lot from it, right? The other thing I was gonna say is that like I think that I just wanted to say a word in defense of modern fantasy, that like there are a lot of great adult modern fantasy that are really deep and do struggle with the deepest questions of life and try to put some bigger themes. Brandon Sanderson's work does that all the time, as well as like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. There are others; those are just the ones I've been reading lately. But yeah,
Yeah.
so there are good fantasy works that are very
Yeah.
much in the vein of Tolkien, even if he is the best of the best.
Rewinding a little bit, it does kind of go back to the old joke about like the English teacher putting more thought into the literature than the author did. Um, like I think that a lot of the themes and sort of minute details that we're pulling out, because you can find a million themes in something as complex as the Lord of the Rings, but I don't think Tolkien was sitting down to write a book that explores all these themes and has all these deep meanings and reflects his worldview in all these ways, because again, he explicitly said he didn't want people to think of it as an allegory. But I think when he sat down to write, uh, an epic fantasy story. And I'm sure he put some thought into the themes, because it's hard to write something like that without following like some sort of themes. But I also don't think that illegitimizes the efforts to pull deeper themes out of it. I think that, going back to the joke, it's like, yeah, I think the English teacher does put more thought into the book than the author does, but I don't think that invalidates the effort they're putting into it. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I'm a strong believer in, like, once the art has been created, it does to a certain extent leave the author's hands. And so there are things that they put into it that they didn't even realize. So I think that it's very worthwhile to look for these sorts of themes, even if you just think that it's just an epic fantasy book and you don't think he put a lot of thought into it in terms of like the deeper philosophical aspects, which personally I think he did. But
Well, yeah, I think maybe the point I'm trying to make is that almost every writer, like writing piece of writing advice I've been given about like and looked at online and stuff has been like, don't ever start being like, hey, I want to write a book that's like gonna bring people to Jesus, but I'm gonna make it a fantasy story, right?
yeah,
You'll end up writing like a very obvious like biased or something like that, right? Like you want to be like, I want to tell a good story, and like then like if you're writing from a Christian worldview, then that stuff will naturally sort of slip into it, right?
yeah,
But I think this is something that I could criticize a lot of books that I think are read pretty widely today. I don't know if you guys have heard of We Are Not Like Them, but there's been a lot of books that have like a pretty clear political message behind them, and it's pretty clear that like they started out wanting to like make a political point and then like tried to sneak in a good story and it didn't work, right? Like it ends up being
Yeah.
like, hey, if you agree with their political message, then you'll like this story. If you don't, then you won't like this story, and that's like pretty much it, right? Like, but yeah, I think that's like sort of a really important part is writing a good story, and then the philosophical, like the deep themes come in later, or as a very natural part of writing the good story, rather than
Yeah.
like as the intention or the sort of the more difficult part. But yeah.
yeah,
Also, the thing about the how much does an author have a say in the work? That's a whole can of worms.
oh yeah, no, I think it's a very controversial topic, but I do think that to a certain extent, once a work is out and has been published, if you try to be too protective of it, it never ends well. Um,
Oh no, yeah. I guess like to me, there's like this deeper sense of like, this is like has a deeper question of like, does art have any objectivity to it and stuff like that. But like, yeah, whenever you find a good book, you feel like you found a good book. You didn't feel like you created a good book by understanding it or reading it or anything
Yeah.
like that, right? I think that's a really important thing is that like, hey, like sure, like an author might have written a long time ago, but like, I don't feel like I'm the one making this experience, despite the fact that like I'm just reading words in a page. It's really
Yeah.
crafted by somebody else, and that's like, I don't know. So that's I think why I think that art is somewhat objective because it's something we find and not something we create by consuming it. So, but, yeah, it's a big can of worms. There's like a really famous article by like some French philosophers, like the author is dead, right? Like literally the author has no impact or say whatever on his work after he writes it. and I disagree pretty strongly with that view.
Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, Keeping the Rings of Power Pure.